Okay, good morning.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Going to get started. A few weeks ago, we had the holiday called Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, the day in which we commemorate the destructions of the two temples. And the Shabbos right after is called Shabbos Nachamu, the Shabbos of consolation, in which we read a section of the book of Isaiah where it says, Nachamu, Nachamu, console, console. God tells the prophets they should console the people. And it's a series of prophetic readings every week until Rosh Hashanah. We read another chapter of Isaiah that deals with the consolation, the comforting of the people. So in that vein, today's class will focus on a section of the Talmud that contains two very powerful stories dealing with the great sage Rabbi Akiva that deals with the theme of consolation. Now these two stories have been discussed by the Rebbe at several occasions. There's one occasion where he spent 5 hours on this story, and they published it. It's a pamphlet about almost 50 pages. So I'm going to give not the word for word, but an adaptation of it to the best of my understanding of what the Rebbe said. Much of what the Rebbe spoke was later published, and the Rebbe would edit it to make sure that it was accurate. So we have about 50 volumes of those that are edited, but there's another 200 volumes of the Rebbe's talks that were not edited by him, that were published based on people's memory of what he said. And this is one of those. So you can't vouch that everything is 100% consistent with what the Rebbe said, even though it was said in a weekday, so it was recorded, and part of it was said on a Shabbos afterwards as well. So, and this is the best in my understanding of it. And it deals with Rabbi Akiva, and we already had many classes in which we discussed Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was one of the most remarkable sages. If you asked me, and this is a hard question to answer, of all the Talmudic sages, who would I single out as the most, I can't say significant, but the one who creates the greatest sense of wonder, I would probably say Rabbi Akiva. I'm not here to measure the great sages, but he certainly stands out as a man who was 40 years old and illiterate, and he became the greatest rabbi of his time and of generations before and after. And the respect and the reverence that the Jewish people had for him was unparalleled. In fact, even when he did something that was proven to be wrong, with the support of Bar Kokhba, the one who he proclaimed as the Mashiach, who was fighting the Romans, and in the end it turned out that Bar Kokhba was a failure, nevertheless, there is no record of people criticizing Rabbi Akiva for supporting Bar Kokhba. So great was the reverence for Rabbi Akiva that even the mistake was not criticized. And it doesn't mean that the rabbis were not eager in criticizing other rabbis. Rabbis are very eager to criticize other rabbis, but somehow Rabbi Akiva stood out. Another thing about Rabbi Akiva is the fact that he was illiterate until he became the greatest sage. It's not just that he was illiterate, he was also not from a distinguished family, a distinguished lineage. His father was a convert, maybe his mother as well, were converts to Judaism. So he came from a outside community that was not known for its aristocratic stature, as were many other great rabbis. Nevertheless, it didn't in any way color people's reverence for him. He was held in such high regard that it's hard for anyone to find someone who has the same, who's enjoyed the same support and honor. So let's go through, this is in the Talmud, Tractate Makkot, and it's important to know the tractate is in. Makkot means lashes. It's one of the punishments the Torah assigns for violating certain laws. You get 39 lashes. And the very end of the tractate that deals with lashes deals with the two stories in which the rabbis were confronting the negative situation of exile. And the Rebbe makes a point of saying that the whole point of ending the Tractate of Makkot, which is a negative tractate, you could say, it deals with negativity, is to emphasize how we get out of negativity. So let's go through the stories, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll try to see how the Rebbe reads deeper meaning into these stories. Now, this is a translation, so the translation leaves out the nuances. So later on we'll get back into some of the nuances. Once, Rabbi Gamliel was the Nasi. He was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was the Jewish leader of his time. So once Rabbi Gamliel, Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah was also the Nasi of the Jewish people. He was from a very distinguished priestly family, very wealthy, and very, very brilliant. In fact, in the Haggadah of Passover, we quote something from him when he says, "I'm like 70 years old, and I couldn't prevail in my dispute with the other rabbis." What does he mean, I was like 70 years old? Either you are 70 or not 70. To be like 70 doesn't make sense, unless you're a teenager speaking today, like, where every other word is like. But the Talmud tells us that he was really 18 years old when he became the leader of the Sanhedrin. And overnight his hair turned white because when he was offered the position, his wife said, you don't look usually the leader of the Sanhedrin was a senior citizen, someone who had a tremendous amount of experience. But overnight he turned white. That was a miracle that happened, and that's why he said, I'm like 70 years old, I'm not really 70. Then is Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Yehoshua was one of Rabbi Akiva's teachers. Rabbi Yehoshua was a Levite, a member of the Levitical family, and when the temple stood, he was one of the singers in the temple. And Rabbi Akiva. So these four sages were traveling on the road, and this is after the destruction of the temple. Where are they traveling? They're traveling to Rome. Why were they traveling to Rome? The Talmud doesn't say, but there are other sources where it talks about how the rabbis would travel to Rome to intercede on behalf of the Jewish people. Because the Roman government, even after the destruction of the temple, after all the misfortune, they were pretty tough on the Jews in Israel, and the rabbis would go to Rome to try to get them to change their decrees. So they're going on the road to Rome. And they heard the sound of the Roman crowds in the plaza of Rome, 120 mil away. A mil is not a mile, it's less than a mile. It's most likely about a half a mile. So they're pretty far away from Rome, and they started to weep. That is, 3 of the 4 rabbis started to weep. But Rabbi Akiva was smiling. Actually, the Hebrew word they used means laughing. I guess the translators didn't feel comfortable translating as laughing because it sounds pretty odd that he would be laughing when everyone else is crying. But the Hebrew word there is laughing. He was laughing, not just smiling. They asked him, "For what reason are you laughing?" He replied to them, "And you, for what reason are you weeping?" That proves Rabbi Akiva was Jewish. He answered a question with a question. And they answered him, "These heathens who bow down to idols and burn incense to idolatry, they live in security and calm. And we, The temple, which is the footstool of our God, is consumed in fire. Should we not weep? So that was their answer. Rabbi Akiva then explained why he laughed in the face of tragedy. He said to them, "For this very reason I am laughing. For if such is the reward for those who transgress his will, that they dwell in such security and calm, then for those who do his will, how much more so, how much greater reward can they expect?" So Rabbi Akiva's response was that yes, they're enjoying life and they're calm and secure and prosperous and they're celebrating. That's why they could hear the din, the noise. It was a vibrant metropolis. But if God does this for people who are violating his will, how much more so that God will do this for those who follow his will. That's the end of the first story. On another occasion, they, and referring to the four sages, the same four rabbis, were coming up to Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. So here they're no longer traveling to Rome, they're going to Jerusalem. We have to assume, we could assume, we don't have to, we could assume that the second story happened after the first story. That after they had gone to Rome, they were coming back, or maybe some other occasion. It doesn't say when this happened. But because the two stories are placed in this order, it's logical to assume that this happened afterwards. Okay, so now they're coming up to Jerusalem, and when they reached Mount Scopus, that's a location where you could see the Temple Mount from that location. The Hebrew word scopus, like the English word scope, means vision. That's where you could see it, a place upon which you could stand and see the Temple Mount. And they were able to see the city of Jerusalem in its destruction. They rent their garments, which is according to Jewish law. Whenever you see the Temple Mount, you have to rip your garment, the same way you tear your garment when you suffer, God forbid, a bereavement, because you see the temple in ruins. The fact that we have the Western Wall is even a greater reminder of the fact that we don't have the temple. And Jews are restricted from going in that area of the Temple Mount. So the law is when you can see the Temple Mount from the distance, you're supposed to rent your garments. And they all did it, including Rabbi Akiva. Now they come to the Temple Mount. They saw a fox emerging from the Holy of Holies. The temple itself was divided into different sections. You had the courtyard, you had the Temple Mount, of course, then you had the courtyard, then you had the sanctuary, and in the sanctuary we had the innermost precinct, was called the Holy of Holies. That was the room that housed the ark during the first temple. We didn't have it during the second temple. And that is the room in which only the high priest could enter on Yom Kippur. Any other time, it was forbidden for anyone, including the high priest, to enter the Holy of Holies. So they see a fox emerging from the Holy of Holies, and they started to cry. But Rabbi Akiva laughed. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing?" He replied to them, "For what reason are you crying?" And they said to him, "A place about which it is written, the non-Kohen who comes close shall die," and that even includes a Kohen. That's only the Kohen Gadol, only the high priest could enter. Anyone else who enters unauthorized is subject to dying at the hands of God. And now, that means it's such a holy place that no one is worthy of entering in such a holy place. And now foxes are walking about there. Should we not cry? So Rabbi Akiva then explained why he was laughing. He said to them, "For this very reason I'm laughing." And he quotes a verse in the book of Isaiah. "For it is written, that God says, I will summon trustworthy witnesses for me. I'm going to summon two prophets, Uriah the Kohen and Zechariah ben Yevarechayahu." So God is referring and summoning two prophets to prophesy about the temple. Now Rabbi Akiva asks a very strong question. What connection does Uriah have with Zechariah? They were not contemporaries. Uriah prophesied during the era of the first temple, whereas Zechariah prophesied during the era of the second temple. Zechariah was one of the last three prophets who prophesied at the time the second temple was built. And Uriah was there for the first temple. Why then are they mentioned together? Rather, Rabbi Akiva said, the two prophets are mentioned together because by doing so, Scripture made the prophecy of Zechariah dependent upon the prophecy of Uriah. Now, what is the prophecy of Uriah? In the prophecy of Uriah it is written, therefore, because of your sinful behavior, Zion, which refers to the temple, will be plowed like a field. It'll be totally, utterly destroyed to the point where it'll be plowed, the ground will be plowed. Nothing will be left of it. That's the prophecy of Uriah. In the prophecy of Zechariah it is written, old men and old women will yet sit in the streets of Jerusalem. In other words, Jerusalem will become a very active place that even older people will be able to sit in the city the way young people go about living in the streets and frequenting the marketplaces. So what Rabbi Akiva is saying that these two prophecies are opposite prophecies. One is a prophecy of utter destruction, one is a prophecy of utter security. And Rabbi Akiva then concluded, as long as the prophecy of Uriah had not been fulfilled, the prophecy of destruction, I had feared that the prophecy of Zechariah would not be fulfilled, because the two prophecies were phrased together in Isaiah. In Isaiah, God says, I'm going to summon these two prophets, Uriah and Zechariah. So I thought, if they're mentioned together, that means one depends on the other. So therefore, I thought as long as the prophecy of Zechariah would not be fulfilled, the prophecy of the good prophecy, maybe the other, as long as the bad prophecy would not be fulfilled, I feared maybe the good prophecy would not be fulfilled. Now that the prophecy of Uriah has been fulfilled, and Jerusalem and the Temple Mount are totally desolate, to the point that even a fox could walk out of the Holy of Holies, it is obvious that the prophecy of Zechariah would also be fulfilled, because the two are juxtaposed, they're linked together, they're considered to be two parts of one prophecy. So therefore, that's why I'm laughing, because by looking at the destruction, I can see how things will be good. They, the rabbis, the three other rabbis, thereupon said to him in these words, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. That's the end of the second story. So there are a lot of questions. The Rebbe asked about 20 questions. I'm not going to go through all 20 questions. The Talmud is not just a book of stories. In fact, 90% of the Talmud is law, discussion of Jewish law. But every now and then you get stories. So it's obvious that the stories are not just there because it's a storybook, but it's because it's trying to teach you something. It's giving you a spiritual message. So the question the Rebbe asks, aren't the two stories similar? What are the two stories? The rabbis see the negative and they cry, and Rabbi Akiva says, I can see the positive, and he laughs. The message is clear from the first story or from the second story. Why do you need two stories? They must be referring to two different scenarios, two different situations. Another question the Rebbe asks, why does it list the names of Rabbi Akiva's colleagues? Most often when the Talmud quotes a dispute between rabbis, and if let's say it's 3 against 1, which happens very often, it won't mention their names. It'll just say, Chachamim, the sages. I could have just said the same way, that Rabbi Akiva was walking with his colleagues, with the sages, and they cried and he laughed. Why mention the names of all 4? And why are the stories presented in this order? So I said before, very likely they happened in this chronological order. But the Talmud is not a history book. It doesn't have to be chronological. It must mean that one story builds on the one before. that you couldn't tell the second story without telling the first story. Also, it doesn't show up in the translation. In the translation, it says, once they were walking. That's not what it says. Once Rabbi Gamliel and were traveling on the road. It doesn't say once. It says that they were in the process of journeying. In other words, this was a continuation of a journey. It's not as if this is the beginning of a journey. It's a continuation of a journey. So what is it trying to tell you? That it's a continuation of a journey, that there's a journey that happened before this, and now we're talking about its continuation. Then there's another question. Why did they cry when they saw how Rome is prosperous? The temple was destroyed. That didn't evoke crying. Yet the prosperity of the Romans evoked crying. Why was that more powerful a cause for them to cry than the fact that the temple itself was destroyed? And also, didn't they know that God promised the rebuilding, that everything would turn out good? They knew that. Rabbi Akiva didn't have to tell them something that they didn't already know. So they knew that ultimately the Jewish people will be redeemed from exile, and the temple will be rebuilt, and the evil people will be punished. So why didn't they know that themselves? Why did they need Rabbi Akiva to tell that to them? Another question, when they came to Mount Scopus, they rent their garments. In other words, you don't rent your garments for happy things. You rent your garment for negative things. So why didn't they cry then? And not only that, Rabbi Akiva also rent his garments. And yet he laughs a few moments later. Then also, Rabbi Akiva cites the prophecy of Uriah and Zechariah, the good prophecy and the bad prophecy. There are hundreds of prophecies in the books of the prophets. Why did he pick on just these? He should have brought all the prophecies of all the things that will be good in the future. There are so many prophecies like that. He could have quoted those. Why did he have to quote this particular prophecy? So the Rebbe asked many other questions, but I'm not going to go into them. So let's see how the Rebbe tackles this whole issue. The Rebbe says this is not just a story. It's a story, but the story has a deeper side to it. And that this is a continuation of a journey. Every part of life is a journey. It starts with birth. That's a journey for the soul. The soul is in paradise. The soul is in a spiritual realm. And it's sent down into this physical world to inhabit a body. That's the first journey. And that's a challenge for the soul, so that the body conforms to the dictates of the Torah, so the soul is not besmirched by people committing crimes, by people sinning, and the soul reaches a higher level, ultimately, when you do a mitzvah. And that's the challenge. That's the first journey. Then, once you're born, your whole life is a journey. So they were journeying their whole lives. This is not the first journey of theirs. Their whole life is a journey. But this is a journey that takes you to another lower level. The journey of galut, of exile. The journey of having to deal with situations that are negative, such as what exile is. This is a continuation, and this is the final journey. And there they're traveling to Rome. Rome symbolizes exile in its worst form. Rome was the power that destroyed the temple. And even though we no longer have Rome as a superpower, they no longer have that power, but Rome symbolizes all the different powers that are enslaving the Jewish people and threatening the Jewish people, including what we have today with Hamas, with the support for evil. This is part of the journey of exile. And this is the journey they were going on. They felt that they had to go to Rome in order to do what a Jew is required to do whenever you're on a journey. What is the purpose of this journey in exile? And why do we need exile? So ostensibly it says we were punished because of our sins and were sent into exile. But that's not the whole story. We're sent into exile because our objective, our mission, is to refine the sparks. The Kabbalists talk about how there are holy sparks in everything in this world. And whenever you engage the world in a positive way, you use your food to give you strength to be able to help someone, you do a mitzvah, you elevate the sparks, which means that you redeem the sparks, you refine, you take the sparks out of their containment, where they're concealed, and you liberate them, and you elevate them. That's the whole goal. And when we have the requisite amount of sparks elevated, that brings us to redemption. So when you go into exile, these sages were going in a process of refining those sparks. So why did we need the temple to be destroyed? Because in the days of the temple, you didn't need to travel anywhere. Why not? Because the light, the fire, the flame, the power that existed in the temple was so great that the sparks would just come to Jerusalem. That's why King Solomon, when he built the temple, what happened? People from other countries, the Queen of Sheba and other countries, were coming to Jerusalem. Why? Because the power, the spiritual power, was so great that everyone is attracted, the sparks that exist all over the world. But because we lost the temple, because of our sins, yes, that's the cause of it, we no longer could elevate the sparks, redeem those sparks and elevate them, because the power in Israel is no longer the same it was when we had the temple. So that's why we have to go everywhere. That's why Jews have traveled and located themselves in every nook and cranny of the world. Wherever you go, you'll find a few Jews there. Why are we in Buffalo? So you might think, well, I got a job here in Buffalo. No, that's not the reason you're in Buffalo. You're in Buffalo because there are sparks in Buffalo, and the sparks needed a Jewish person to liberate them. So God made it that you should find a job here, and that's why you moved here. There's a verse in the book of Psalms, the footsteps of man are set forth by God. We think that we're here for whatever reason. No, you're there because you have a mission in that particular place. And whenever you travel anywhere, whatever situation you're in, you have to look at it as there's a challenge there. There's something that I have to do in that place. I mentioned this many times. If you take a wrong turn on a road and you think, well, how clumsy of me that I made the wrong turn. No, God wants you to be in that place. He wants you maybe to say a prayer there, recite a psalm. Maybe there's someone you can help there. Maybe there's a car that's got stuck on the road and you're there to help them repair their flat tire. There might be a challenge for you wherever you are. And when you help that person, when you do that mitzvah, you're liberating the sparks of that particular area. And you're bringing us closer to the final redemption. And you're getting rid of the cause of Golus, the cause of exile. That's what these sages were doing. They were on the road to finish off with this, hoping that they're going to finish off the challenge of exile by refining all those sparks. And it's only natural, intuitively, when you're in the state of exile, when you see how bad the exile is, what's your natural response is you want to cry. You want to cry that the world is so covering up all these sparks. But then why do they cry specifically when they heard the sound of Rome? And that's why Rabbi Akiva was saying to them, why are you crying now? People could go through negative experiences, and they get used to it, they're not going to cry. They cry when something abruptly changes for the worse, something surprising. So the answer they gave is that, yes, it's true, we're on a mission. We're on a mission to refine the sparks and to try to minimize and diminish the power of exile. However, we don't feel those sparks. The sound of those sparks of holiness have to be loud enough that we could hear them, because those sparks are asking to be elevated, to be redeemed, and their sound is muted. And it's drowned out by the sound of Rome. That means the exile had become so intolerable, so extreme, that those sparks don't, and they should be, feel the need to express themselves, and yet there's no response. We don't hear those sparks. That means they're beyond our ability to refine them, because you have to be able to hear it. And it's being drowned out by the sound of Rome. They weren't just referring to the physical sound of Rome. They were talking about the spiritual cloud of Rome. That Rome was so impure, was so negative, that it was not allowing them to hear the sound of the sparks. Instead, they're hearing the sound of Rome, the sound of the evil forces. Not only that, but this is the footstool, the temple, which was referred to as the footstool, is consumed in fire, and the heathens are bringing incense to idolatry. What do they mean by that? They meant to say that the temple, the whole idea of the temple is to take all these sparks and burn them on the altar. They should be consumed in the heavenly flame. And now, not only that's not happening, but they're taking incense, which was the ultimate service in the temple. The temple had two main services. You had the sacrifices, which in Hebrew are called korban, and you had the incense called ketoros. What's the difference between them spiritually? Korban comes from the word close. It brought people close to God. Incense is ketoret. That comes from a root that means to be bound, to be knotted. It's stronger than just being close. You could be close to someone, but you're not knotted together, you're not united. And when a person brought a sacrifice, it brought him closer to God. It brought the world closer to God. When a person brought the incense, it not only brought you closer, it bound you with God. It was a much more powerful connection. So not only is that not happening in the temple, but on the contrary, it's being used for idolatry. There can't be anything lower. When you see something going so low, what does that prove? It proves that it has a very high source. The higher something is, the lower it goes. When you see something very low, it means that it has a very high spiritual root. So then we should be hearing these sparks crying out to us, liberate me. Look how far down I've gone. And we don't hear. The exile has become so powerful that we don't hear it. And that could be said today about how so many Jews don't hear, they don't even realize they're in exile. They don't even realize that the sparks of holiness that we each possess is in distress. When you don't hear someone in distress, that's much more dangerous than a person could be very seriously ill. But as long as they can cry out for help, they're not beyond help. You can help them and save them. But when they can't cry out anymore, when their cries are so muffled, then that's very dangerous. And that's why they cried. They weren't just crying because there was exile. They weren't just crying because Rome is powerful and the temple was destroyed. They were crying because they said, our whole mission is in vain. Why are we going to Rome? Why are we traveling this road? Because we're trying to elevate the sparks, bring an end to exile, when the exile conditions are so intense and so massive that we can't even accomplish. We're going to fail in our mission. That's why they were crying. Not just because Rome was prosperous and the temple was destroyed. That they knew beforehand. They didn't have to travel to figure that out. But what they sensed was that our journey is not going to be a productive journey. And what does Rabbi Akiva tell them? Rabbi Akiva tells them that if this is true, that evil has such a power, that doesn't make any sense. That evil should have so much power that it can completely drown out the sound, the voice of the sparks of the holiness. That means that they're enjoying something that doesn't make any sense. It transcends logic. So if that is true about the evil people, that God is rewarding them, even though it makes no sense that they should be rewarded. The fact that you see that evil people prosper in this world, is a sign that God is doing something that is totally not based on rationality, then you could imagine that for the good people, it'll certainly be even stronger. God's reward for us will be infinitely greater and it will not be subject to rationality. If it was only based on rationality, everything is measure for measure. You do so much good, you'll get so much reward. You do so much evil, you get so much punishment. And Rabbi Akiva was telling them that God is going to behave with us in ways that go beyond. Even if we think that we're not deserving, God will still reward us and still give us. It'll be much stronger than anything that you're seeing now. And the fact that you can't see the sparks, that itself tells you how irrational, how transrational God's behavior is with them. And it's a way of reminding you that with us He'll be so much more powerful and so much more redemptive, because God is not going to limit Himself to tit for tat, that you do this, you'll get this. God is going to go beyond everything. And that's why I'm laughing, Rabbi Akiva said. It's going to be something out of this world. And that's what the Jewish people have always believed. And Rabbi Akiva articulated this, that the coming of Mashiach, the final Messianic age, will be a period that will be such good that we will be able to understand all the negative in the past. There's a biblical verse that says, I thank God because He has shown me anger, His anger. What does that mean? You thank God because He's angry at you? That when Mashiach comes, and only then, will be able to understand why there's suffering in this world. Because the good will be so incredible that it'll make even the suffering understandable. The Rebbe would often talk about how people should not try to give explanations for the suffering, for the Holocaust and other great tragedies like that, because no explanation is adequate. There's no way a human being could understand that. The only way you can understand that is when you're going to be exposed to something that transcends logic in the Messianic age. And that's what Rabbi Akiva was hinting, that things will be so great that you will understand even the suffering and the pain, and you will understand why the evil has this power. But until then, we can't understand it. But Rabbi Akiva was living with the future. The Rebbe in another discourse emphasizes how Rabbi Akiva's general attitude to life was always different from everyone else's. Whenever anything negative happened, what did Rabbi Akiva say? Whatever God does is for the good. But once he was traveling with a donkey for transportation, a rooster as an alarm clock, and a candle to illuminate the dark so we could study. And he came to this town and he knocks on the door of one of the people, and he says, can I sleep over the night? He said, no, absolutely not. And he went from door to door and they all rejected him. So he went to sleep in the forest. In the middle of the night, a wind came and extinguished the candle. And before he went to the forest, he said, no one wanted me. Whatever God does is for the good. He didn't feel bitter about it. It must be good. And he comes to the forest and the candle is extinguished. He couldn't study. He says, whatever God does is for the good. And then a mountain lion came, or maybe a real lion. In Israel those days they had lions. A lion came and killed the donkey. Whatever God does is for the good. Then a fox came, or a wolf, or whatever, and consumed the rooster. The next morning he wakes up, he goes through town. The whole town was ransacked by bandits, and everyone was taken prisoner. And he realized that if the candle had been burning, if the donkey was alive and the rooster was alive, or if they would have let him into their town to sleep, he would have been in bad straits. So Rabbi Akiva had that attitude. He always looked into the future. And that's what Rabbi Akiva is saying over here, that yes, it looks pretty bad, but by looking at how bad it is, it makes you realize that God's greatness and goodness to us is going to be beyond any limits. That's the first story. The second story, before I finish the second story, I left out a point in the first story. the rabbis were going on this road, and they hear the sound of tumult of Rome. So the Rebbe asked one of the questions he asks, weren't they engaged in the Torah, study of Torah? When rabbis would travel, that was the only thing they did. They were preoccupied with the study of Torah. They wouldn't interrupt for anything. So all of a sudden they're listening to the sounds of Rome. So the Rebbe says, yes, when you're in exile, as much as you have to be immersed in the Torah study, you have to hear, you have to listen to what's going on, because there's a mission for you to relate to that place you're in and to elevate those sparks. So no matter how great you are, no matter how steeped you are in the study of Torah, and for people who are steeped in the study of Torah, there can be nothing more painful than to stop learning. If you take a person of the caliber of Rabbi Akiva, and you tell him you have to stop learning Torah because you have to do something to help someone, it's very painful, because Torah becomes your very essence, your very life. There's a story with the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, and his son, who later on became his successor. And when the Alter Rebbe lived in the upper story of the house, and his son lived in the bottom level after he was married. And the son had a little baby, and the little baby started crying because it fell out of its cradle. The Alter Rebbe, the grandfather, hears the cry of the child. He was in the middle of studying Torah, and he goes down, and his son is oblivious to what happened. His son was immersed in the study of Torah, and the Alter Rebbe picks up the baby and soothes it and puts it back in the cradle. And when he speaks to his son later on, he says, no matter how deeply immersed you are in the study of Torah, you have to hear the cry of a child. But you can see from the fact that he didn't hear it, how difficult it would be for someone of that caliber to hear it. And the lesson is that no matter how high you go, you have to always be attuned to what's going on in the world and reacting to what's going on in a way that you can help whatever is going on that needs to be helped, and in the spiritual sense, elevating those sparks. So these rabbis, though they were traveling on this road and certainly engaged and engrossed in the study of Torah, when they heard the sound of Rome, that was something that they had to pay attention to. Now they're no longer on the journey into exile. Now they're on the journey to Jerusalem. What does that mean? So the Rebbe says that sometimes a person on a very high level could finish his mission in terms of getting rid of exile. No one else is at that level, but they're at that level. They're no longer in exile state of mind. They already fulfilled their mission. And now they're going to Jerusalem. Now they're going to see if they're ready for the third temple. They're trying to gauge their readiness for the future. So this is the second part of the journey. The journey consists of two directions. We have a direction of getting rid of exile, and we have the direction of preparing ourselves for the redemption. And now they're in the second leg of this journey. So the two journeys are connected. One has to happen before the other. You can't be prepared for the redemption before you deal with the exile conditions. And here they come to Mount Scopus, they rent their garments, but they didn't cry at that point. Why? Because there was nothing out of the ordinary. They were well aware of the fact that the temple was in ruins. They were well aware of the fact that the Jews are in exile. So crying is only when there's a certain radical shift, a certain reorientation of what's going on. And when they see the fox coming out of the Holy of Holies, that's when they started to cry. So Rabbi Akiva asked them, why are you crying? What was the reason for crying? Rabbi Akiva knew that this is a very sad situation, but he said, what's new? What changed? This was always, we knew this already before. This is not the first time that they saw the temple in ruins. So why are you crying now? So they said, the reason why we're crying is because it's the Holy of Holies. Well, what does that mean spiritually? Spiritually, that means every one of us has a soul, but there's a part of the soul that is considered to be the Holy of Holies. It's the part of the soul that always remains intact. That even a Jew who's estranged from Judaism, and a time will come, God forbid, that he's told, or she's told, either you convert to another religion or you'll be killed. The Iliterate Rebbe in Tanya says that there are so many Jews who were not steeped in Judaism, who would not practice anything or care about it, but would give their lives. Why is that? Because when that choice is given to a Jew, that awakens the Holy of Holies of his soul. And that Holy of Holies can't be extinguished. And therefore, the person will even be prepared to die. You can cover up every other part of your soul. You can cover up the soul's intellect. You can cover up the soul's feelings. But its essence cannot be covered up. Yes?
What does that essence, what do you call it in English, that essence?
In English, I can tell you the Hebrew word, yichida. It's the core.
What you would refer to that essence of your soul as the yichida?
Yeah, right. So here they come to the Holy of Holies, and they see the Holy of Holies is corrupted. Then there's no hope. That's what made them cry. When you can see a Jew who is confronting a situation where a fox is coming out of the Holy of Holies, and the Rebbe explains what the significance of the fox. The Rebbe refers to another story in the Talmud. The story is told of Rabbi Akiva. Again, Rabbi Akiva is discussing the fact that he was rebelling against the Roman decree that you're not allowed to teach Torah, and they threatened to murder anyone who would publicly teach Torah, and he kept on teaching Torah publicly. So someone challenged him. He says, "Aren't you afraid that you can lose your life?" And he used a famous parable of the fox. The fox is standing at the bank of the river, and he sees the fish are running back and forth and trying to escape something. So he asks the fish, where are you running? He says, fishermen had cast their nets nearby and were trying to evade the nets. So we shouldn't be caught. So the fox says, so why don't you come on land and be with me? I'll take good care of you. And so the fish say to the fox, you're so smart, you're so sly. If in the water, which is our source of life, we can't survive, how much more so on land that we will not be able to survive? And Rabbi Akiva applied that to Torah. That Torah is the source of our life. If even learning Torah we're not secure, how much more so if we stop learning Torah, we certainly won't be secure. So what does the fox try to do? The fox symbolizes, the fox is called the sly as a fox. This fox is supposed to be smart. I never realized why foxes are so smart. Anyone have any knowledge about why foxes are considered to be smart? But whatever they are, they're the symbol, they're the metaphor for smartness, being clever. He says, what is the fox doing? He's taking Torah, which is really, in a way, the Holy of Holies of the Jew. Because what's in the Ark? What was in the Holy of Holies? The Ark. What's the Ark? The Ark is the essence of the Torah, the core of the Torah. So you're taking Torah and saying Torah is dangerous. You're taking the core, you're taking the Holy of Holies, and saying that the Holy of Holies is not good for you, because it puts your life in danger. And that's when you see a fox coming out of the Holy of Holies, metaphorically what that means is that you're claiming that the Holy of Holies is corrupted. That it's causing you to have these problems. And when you see the Holy of Holies being corrupted, there's no hope, was their argument. That's why they cried. Because as long as the Holy of Holies was intact, they would feel comforted. But the Holy of Holies was being compromised. And to them it meant that who knows if there's ever going to be any hope. And you look at the world today, you look how far some Jews have gone, that they're not even aware that they are Jewish. They're not even aware that there's anything about them that makes them different, it makes them special. God, tragically, it took October 7th to awaken many Jews, but we still have to awaken many more. So that's what they were crying about. And Rabbi Akiva said, no, that's the reason why I'm laughing. Because the greater the destruction, the more the rebuilding. Because destruction is not just something that comes before rebuilding. Destruction and rebuilding were put together in one prophecy. And what is the prophecy? It's about, it's like a field being plowed. What is the definition of plowing? Plowing is a paradox. When you're plowing, you're destroying the earth. You're disrupting the form of the earth. But what is plowing for? For sowing, for planting. You can't plant without plowing. So he says the fact that these prophecies were referred to as the temple was plowed means that in the destruction we already have the kernel of rebuilding. That in all this negativity we already have the positivity. And the Rabbi Akiva, when he says if the destruction wouldn't have been so strong, I don't know about how the rebuilding would be. What he meant by that is that there are many scenarios that could happen with a rebuilding. It could be a moderate rebuilding, or it could be a maximum amount. The fact that the destruction was so total to the point that you can't even see the Holy of Holies functioning, that means that the rebuilding will also be equally so powerful that it's beyond our understanding and beyond anything you could imagine. It'll be the most extreme. And when he said that, they realized that they had to be comforted. When you can see in the destruction, you see the rebuilding. Now, it wasn't that Rabbi Akiva was oblivious to the fact that there was this. He also rent his garment. The Jew has to have this paradox. When something bad happens, you're supposed to feel the pain and the suffering. But at the same time, you have to realize that there's a hidden good in that. And that hidden good is part of the negative. And that's why he said, that's why they said you comforted us. What does comforting mean? The Hebrew word comforting, in English, it has only one translation. Nechama is consolation or comforting, but it also comes from a root that means a paradigm shift. When God doesn't like the way the world was behaving before the flood, God says, Kinichamti, I changed my mind. I regret having created them. That means God is having a paradigm shift. However we explain that about God. Same thing is, what is consolation? Consolation is not, things are bad, so I'm going to make you feel a little better. You shouldn't focus on how bad things are. Consolation means there's a total different paradigm shift. You look at things in a totally different way. And that's how Rabbi Akiva was trying to impress upon us, to look at the negativity in a totally different way, that it's part of the process of positivity, part of the process of redemption. That, in a nutshell, is what the Rebbe says in 50 pages. And here, any questions?
This kind of mirrors about Moshe not entering the promised land. Right, in previous weeks.
Yeah. Everything negative that you read in the Torah has a positive side to it. Even the destruction of the temple, it says, if the temple had not been destroyed, God would have displayed his anger and taken it out on the people. So the temple saved our lives. And that's one of the reasons given why Moses didn't enter the land, because if he would have entered, the temple would not have been destroyed. If he would have built it, it wouldn't have been destroyed. Then we would have been harmed by that.